You know what this channel needs? Just a little bit more controversy.
What do you think about the ones that are not officially licensed? Again, like the fan appropriations and fan art, fan stories, fan rewriting.
I've long been an opponent of fan fiction.
You know, let's attack one of the biggest authors ever for one of their opinions that they made years ago. I'm sure this will go over very well.
Well, I basically agree with George that his ideas are his ideas. Somebody, you know, his characters are his characters. For us, it doesn't have much effect because none of it is very powerful. Some of it creates good publicity and some of it is annoying, but frankly, we don't pay a whole heck of a lot of attention to it.
Ooh. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to unpack about fan fiction and what exactly George R.R. Martin's problem with it seems to be. And honestly, I'm not a fan of fan fiction coming from George R.R. Martin. It's a little bit of an interesting take, an author who is arguably known for one of the most universally reviled versions of fan fiction ever created. And you know, yes, I guess that's a bit of a low blow, but you know what? I'm still hurting over the lack of additional seasons. On the face of it, not liking fan fiction is an opinion. It's an opinion I happen to disagree with, but it's one that I think has a bit more weight to it, especially given the gravitas that George R.R. Martin carries. So I wanted to kind of go into it a little bit and really try to elevate fan fiction a bit. And it's not like George R.R. Martin has a bunch of terrible opinions either. In fact, he has some wonderful quotes that a lot of writers could do with listening to, like this one. Writing is a terrible career if you're looking at it as a way to have a career. Ask yourself the question, what if no one ever gives me a penny for my stories? Will I still write them? And if the answer is yes, then you're a writer. Now, this is where I get a little bit confused with George R.R. Martin, because in this second quote, he seems to be talking more about the openness of writing and creativity and the artistry of storytelling, not as necessarily a career or a way to make money, as much as just the ability and the will and desire to write and tell stories. And yet, the way that he talks about fan fiction and the way that I am interpreting it seems to be a bit more possessive over his characters, his story, his settings. At least that's how I am interpreting it, which could, in all honesty, be completely wrong. But before we get too far, I want to express here that this video is about fan fiction and elevating fan fiction as a form of writing. I am not trying to redefine copyright law or anything like that. This is in the broad sense talking about the sometimes disparaged art of fan fiction, and also how it's probably more prevalent in some mainstream books that you have already read by very world-renowned authors, New York Times best-selling authors that could, by the definitions given here, could essentially be considered fan fiction.
And let me define fan fiction very precisely here, because sometimes I get criticized by people saying, you wrote fan fiction when you were young and now you criticize it, how dare you? I wrote what we called fan fiction in the 60s in comic fandom, but that was simply fiction written by fans,
Right.
and published without any money. And I certainly did a lot of that, but I never borrowed anybody else's character or world. I was a comic fan. I didn't write about Spider-Man or Superman or Batman. I created my own heroes.
Let me really stick my fucking foot in it with this one, because I'm going to give a quote here, a quote that I may regret in the next 5 years, or more likely, I may regret by the time I post this video. All fiction is on some level fan fiction. Is there a distinction between what would be considered an original work and fan fiction, both in layman's terms and in, of course, copyright law? Yes, yes, of course there is. That's not what I'm talking about here, though. What I'm trying to get at here is that we like to use a word in place of fan fiction a lot in writing. It's a word that does a fuck ton of heavy lifting, like an absolute metric fuck ton of heavy lifting, to try and make it seem like we are more or less creating our own worlds and creating our own stories and creating our own characters. And that word is inspiration. We use it when we're talking about how things are inspired by, how stories are inspired by other stories we've read or seen or watched, or historical events, how characters are inspired by, how we are inspired by other authors. But what makes something an inspiration versus fan fiction? That's something we're going to try and get into here with a couple examples. First, we'll start with my own books, and then we'll go to George R.R. Martin's books, and finally, we'll end with some that are best-selling authors that might actually be considered fan fiction. So my books are heavily inspired by the American Revolution. Essentially, what I was trying to do when I started writing them was I wanted to make a kind of The Man in High Castle, but take it and merge it with Hamilton. Because at the time I started writing, Hamilton was on, and I had that shit on repeat. Like, I just listened to it over and over and over again, and I really wanted to see what would happen if I created a historical fiction on what would have happened if England had won. As someone who is half English and half American, it's always been a bit of an interesting conundrum to me when I try to tell my mother Happy 4th of July. It's a bit awkward sometimes, although I did like sending her a lot of memes. It's kind of funny. But I quickly learned how I just hated how confining that was. I learned within the first couple pages that I really just did not like having to find specific locations. I actually started that if you read my books, you'd be familiar with the very beginning and how there's an island. You know, I'm trying to avoid spoilers here, but there's a small island in a river. And that river is actually based on a place in Washington, D.C. that I visited with my father. And I was trying to take all those places and make them real, and I was just like, shit, this is too fucking time consuming, and it's a real pain in the dick. So instead, I just made shit up. And that's essentially what happened. I was inspired by things and I made things up. But here's the big fucking but. If I was not so heavily inspired, if I didn't pull from historical events, that real events that happened, if I didn't pull from events in different time frames, different countries, different locations, if I didn't pull from different cultures, if I didn't look at different characters that had been written. I mean, hell, there is a character that is so heavily inspired by Moriarty and Thrawn from Timothy Zahn's Star Wars books that if I hadn't read those, one as a kid and one more recently, then that character would probably be completely fucking different. And I think that is what's so key. I'm inspired, yes, but it's not that far removed from fan fiction, because if those things didn't exist, if I didn't have that to pull from, the stories would not exist. My books would not exist. I would have probably written something completely different. So no, I didn't use characters from other people, and I didn't use settings from other people, but it's still not that far removed from fan fiction, which is why I wanted to point out that we're still using the same kind of process. And it's not just me. George R.R. Martin basically did the exact same thing. His inspiration actually draws from plays from none other than Shakespeare, but it goes beyond the plays of Richard III and Hamlet. And we already have huge long Reddit threads from fans of George R.R. Martin that break down the different inspirations that he takes from those plays from William Shakespeare. I mean, hell, in the books you had Lancaster to Lannister, you had York to Stark, you had Tyrell to Tyrell. But even those events, even the events that were used in the plays that Shakespeare wrote, well, they're inspired by true historical events. They're inspired by the English struggle for the crown, the War of the Roses. So from the historical events that actually happened, to Shakespeare's plays, to the books written by George R.R. Martin, to whatever the fuck the ending of Game of Thrones was, I'm so sorry, I keep going back to that. It really shows that without certain things, without certain inspirations, those stories wouldn't exist, and there are direct ways that you can take from it. You're essentially what it is you're borrowing it and then changing it. So I think the main difference here that a lot of people will point to is that when the borrowing is happening, there's the change. And when a lot of people look at fan fiction, it's just directly borrowing. But that's not entirely true, at least as far as I'm concerned, because changes are still happening. There's a reason why it's called fiction. There are 381 canon Star Wars novels written by many authors. Some, like Ahsoka by E.K. Johnston, center around a character created by someone else. But would anyone say that her beautifully written creative work isn't their own? God, no. It's her work. It's her beautiful prose and characterization. It's her dialogue. What about how she breathed life into Padme Amidala with truly engaging and inspiring books covering the Padme that we didn't actually get to see in the movies? It would be the same for Claudia Gray and her portrayals of Leia Organa. These are original works from their creative minds, but they actually are using characters and settings that are quote unquote borrowed. Wouldn't these books then, by this definition, actually just be considered fan fiction? And if they are fan fiction, what does that mean? Does that mean that they are somehow lesser because they didn't come up with every single character themselves? That they used different things that they researched to do it? And if that's the case, what the fuck do you say about historical fiction? Because that's just real people and taking those real people and characterizing them yourself. Well, I mean, you can't exactly go into and like do different historical events. Like the story is already kind of there. But remove yourself a little bit from that. Let's pretend that there are new characters involved. The same settings, but new characters. We don't have to pretend that much because that's exactly what Timothy Zahn did. Timothy Zahn is the creator of Thrawn, a character that we're actually soon going to be seeing in live action. And the character was created within the Star Wars universe. It is not his universe. He didn't create Star Wars. That's something that does not belong to him. He borrowed the setting. It is all sanctioned fiction. All of this is sanctioned fiction. And then they have to, obviously abide by certain things. But that's still not his. And yet those books, the Thrawn books, are some of the best books I have ever read. Same with Claudia Gray and their beautiful book, Lost Stars, which creates her own characters, but it's still based on Star Wars and the setting, and uses many characters like Timothy Zahn does that are actually created by other people. But let's take it even one further step back. Let's look at R.A. Salvatore. R.A. Salvatore created Drizzt Do'Urden and a host of other characters and pioneered some of the biggest events in the Forgotten Realms universe. Yet, Forgotten Realms itself was created by Ed Greenwood all the way back in 1967, with the campaign set for Forgotten Realms releasing in 1987. The realms themselves began to incorporate from other authors as well, using locations that were created by Tracy and Laura Hickman, for example. Only a year later, R.A. Salvatore released The Crystal Shard, which would introduce everybody to Drizzt and the Companions of the Hall, and began an incredible run of bestsellers for one of my absolute favorite authors of all times, within the created universe of another creator. I've included links to all these books down below, by the way, so if you're looking for a good read, especially if you like Star Wars, or if you like Dungeons & Dragons type Forgotten Realms stuff, some of these books down here, they are some of my absolute favorite books that I have ever read, and highly recommend them. If you want to pick them up, check them out. Especially E.K. Johnston and Claudia Gray. I think sometimes they don't get mentioned as much, but their works, they are so full of emotional depth and beauty, and they really do a fantastic job of bringing characters to life that are not fucking theirs. Please check out those wonderful, amazing authors. I think all of them at one time have been on the New York Times bestseller list. Yeah, just check them out. So you might say through this whole argument that one of the issues that George R.R. Martin may have with fan fiction is the unsanctioned nature of it. In all of these examples, it is essentially being given the go-ahead, either through use of inspiration or by actually being part of a larger source. There are fact checkers, there's things going on with everything that has using different source material that is being covered by multiple authors to try and at least consider some consistency. After all, Timothy Zahn, one of the examples, recreated his entire trilogy on Thrawn after the move over from canon to non-canon. So there are books on Thrawn that are not canon, and there are books on Thrawn that are canon, just to confuse everyone and make sure that I guess there's more books being sold. But really what I wanted to point out here is that fan fiction itself isn't a bad word. It's not so far removed as to not be considered writing. Some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read has been fan fiction, both sanctioned and unsanctioned, written by friends of mine that have so much talent in what they're doing. Just because they are borrowing characters and taking what they learned from those characters and really creating it into their own story with their own plot, their own dialogue, their everything that changes in the story, sometimes drastically so. And yes, there is shit fan fiction, but you know what else? There's a whole lot of shit original work too. That's just absolute garbage. So I don't think we can look at the one bad piece of fan fiction we read when we were 16 and say that that's everything, because to do so is unfair to the authors who put their heart and soul into fan fiction.